Dust lifted in thin veils as the morning warmed, the kind of heat that crept up from the ground and settled into a man's bones before he noticed it was there. The ranch lay quiet again, too quiet for what he'd seen at first light. The ridges were empty now. No raídas, no silhouettes, just rock and scrub and the pale sky stretching wide and indifferent. It would have been easier if they'd stayed. Easier to believe what his eyes had already told him. Instead, the absence pressed harder than their presence ever had. He moved through his chores with the same deliberate care he always used when the world felt uncertain. He checked the water troughs first, listening for the steady glug that told him the well was still drawing clean. The bucket came up heavy, cool water flashing silver before spilling into the trough. The horses crowded in, snorting, their sides twitching with nerves they couldn't explain. Animals always knew before men did. He rested a hand on the nearest neck, feeling muscle shift under his palm, steadying both of them. By mid-morning, dust rose on the southern trail. One rider, then two more, strung out like they didn't trust each other enough to ride close. He watched from the porch, thumb hooked his belt, rifle leaning against the doorframe where it always stood. They didn't draw weapons. They didn't wave. They just came on, slow and careful, as if approaching a sleeping rattler. They reined in at the edge of the yard. The lead rider spat, wiped his mouth, and spoke like he was delivering bad weather. Word was moving fast. Too fast for a place that usually took weeks to notice anything at all. A woman fitting her description had been seen again, this time not alone. A wedding, they said. No priest, no town. Just vows spoken on dirt that didn't belong to anyone who would care to stop it. Men were angry. Men with long memories and longer grudges. The kind who counted loyalty like currency and spent it on blood. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The look on his face said enough. The riders shifted, uneasy, and left as they come, dust swallowing them whole. She returned that evening. He heard her before he saw her, boots scuffing stone with a path dipped behind the mesquite. She didn't call out. She never did. She stood at the edge of the yard, taller than he remembered, or maybe he was just seeing her clearer now. Her wounds had closed into dark seams across her skin. The blood was gone, but the eyes were the same, measuring, remembering. He handed her water without a word. She drank slower this time. When she was done, she stayed. That was how it began. Days folded into weeks with the quiet inevitability of the land itself. She slept in the spare room at first, then closer, then not at all apart. They spoke little, but when they did, it mattered. He learned she had buried her husband with her own hands under sky just as wide as this one. He learned his name carried weight in places where men still argued over what justice meant. He learned that being his widow was a sentence as much as a title. The marriage wasn't announced. It didn't need to be. By the time the rings were exchanged, rumors had already outrun them, galloping ahead on frightened mouths and angry imaginations. 500 men, some said. More, others whispered. Men who believed revenge was owed like a debt with interest. Inside the cabin, life took on a different rhythm. She cooked. He fixed what broke. At night, the wind pressed against the walls and the world felt smaller, safer, held together by lamplight and shared breath. He found himself thinking in terms he hadn't used before. Us. Ours. Tomorrow. The first shot came at dusk. It cracked across the valley and punched into the corral fence, sending splinters flying. The horses screamed. He had the rifle in his hands before the echo died. She was already moving, calm where panic should have lived, pulling the lantern down, plunging the room into shadow. They didn't come that night. Just a warning. Just the sound of it, ringing in the ears long after the dark had settled. He lay awake listening to her breathe, counting the seconds between heartbeats, wondering how many men it took to tear apart something that had barely begun. In the morning, the cattle were scattered. One lay dead near the creek, throat cut clean, a message written in blood. He didn't need help reading. He buried it himself, jaw set, shovel biting into hard ground. She stood watch, rifle steady, eyes scanning the hills where dust devils twisted like restless spirits. When the second message came, it came in numbers. They lined the ridges again, this time closer, banners tied to lances, faces uncovered. 500 men, give or take. Some he recognized. Others were strangers drawn by the promise of a reckoning. They didn't advance. They waited. He stepped out alone, hands empty, boots crunching gravel that sounded too loud in the hush. A voice called from the ridge, carrying easily on the dry air. The terms were simple. Give her up, walk away alive, keep her and everything burned. He didn't answer right away. He looked back once at the cabin, at the woman standing in the doorway, framed by shadow and light. Family, he realized, wasn't something you were born into. It was something you chose and paid for again and again. He turned back to men on the ridge and shook his head. That night, the fire started on the north pasture. Flames crawled through dry grass, licking at the dark, turning the sky a bruised orange. Gunfire followed, sporadic, testing, like fingers tapping on a locked door. He moved with purpose now, no hesitation left to waste. Trenches dug where cattle once grazed. Stone stacked, water cached. She worked beside him without needing to be told. Every motion sure, as if she'd been preparing for this long, before she ever collapsed against his fence. When dawn came, it came on smoke. The valley no longer felt empty. It felt full of eyes, full of intent, full of the kind of silence that only existed right before something terrible decided to speak. He took her hand once, brief and firm, and let it go. Whatever happened next, it would not be quiet. The fire burned itself out before sunrise, leaving black scars across the north pasture and a smell that clung to everything it touched. Ash drifted down like gray snow, settling on the roof, the troughs, the backs of the horses standing stiff and wide-eyed in the corral. No shots followed the night. No riders pushed forward. It was as if the valley itself was holding its breath. He moved at first light, slow and careful, circling the property with a rifle loose in his hands. Tracks cut the soft ground near the creek, dozens of them, boots and hooves mixed together. They hadn't crossed the water. Not yet. That meant patience. Or planning. Inside the cabin, she was already awake, tying her hair back with a strip of cloth, movements precise, controlled. She met his eyes and nodded once. No fear, just resolve. Whatever this had become, it was no longer something that could be avoided. By noon, a small group rode down from the eastern ridge under a strip of white cloth. Not a truce, an invitation. They stopped well short of the yard and waited. He went to them alone this time, dust puffing under his boots with each step. The man who spoke was older, his face carved by sun and hard choices. He said there was no stopping what was coming. Too many men, too much anger. The widow was a symbol now, and symbols didn't get to live quiet lives. He said if the ranch burned, it wouldn't be personal, just necessary. He listened, then answered with something the man didn't expect. He said the land had been empty when he found it, empty of people, not of meaning. He said he'd built something here with his hands. He said if they wanted her, they would have to take her from him, and he would make them remember every step it took to do it. The riders left without another word. That night, they sat at the small table with a single lamp between them. She spoke more than she ever had before. She talked about her husband, not as a legend, but as a man, flawed, fierce, capable of kindness when no one was watching. She talked about the child they never had, the life that had been promised and stolen before it could take shape. He listened, feeling the weight of something unspoken settle between them. She placed a small bundle on the table. Inside was a strip of cloth, faded and worn, wrapped around a lock of hair. "Family," she said quietly, what was left of it. He understood then that this wasn't just about survival. It was about refusing to let the past decide the future. The first attack came at dawn. Gunfire cracked from the west, sharp and close, bullets chewing into the side of the cabin. He dragged her down as glass exploded inward, splinters raining across the floor. They moved as one now, practiced without ever having practiced, returning fire through narrow slits they cut into the walls the night before. Horses screamed. Men shouted. Smoke rolled in thick and choking. They didn't try to rush the house. Not yet. They probed, testing defenses, counting shots. He saw one man fall near the creek, Another dragged back by his heels. The valley echoed with sound and fury, then fell quiet again, like a storm pausing to gather strength. By the third day, supplies were running thin. Water was still clean, but food had become precious. Sleep came in fragments. The cabin bore scars, holes punched clean through it that had stood for years. He felt older, heavier, but steadier too, like something inside him had finally found its purpose. On the fourth morning, the hills filled. 500 men spread across every rise and hollow, rifles glinting in the sun. Drums began to beat, low and steady, a sound that crawled into the chest and tightened the heart. She stood beside him on the porch, rifle resting against her shoulder, posture straight. She did not look small. A voice carried from the ridge again, offering the same terms, louder now, edged with impatience. Give her up. Walk away. Live. She stepped forward before he could speak. She said her name once, into the open air, claiming it. She said she was done running. She said the blood they wanted would not wash away what had already been done. She said if they came, they would come knowing why they were dying. The answer was a gunshot. It broke everything loose. Men surged down the slopes, shouting, firing, the earth shaking under the weight of them. He fired until the rifle burned his hands, reloaded without thinking, moved when she moved, covered when she covered. Smoke swallowed the yard. Fire took the roof. Flames roaring as drywood finally gave in. When the cabin collapsed, they were already gone, slipping into trenches, drawing the fight into narrow spaces where numbers meant less. He saw faces close now, fear and fury tangled together. He felt a blow glance off his shoulder, felt heat, pain, but kept moving. At the creek, the fight turned desperate. Water ran red. Men fell, some screaming, some silent. He lost sight of her in the chaos, panic flaring sharp and wild, until he heard her voice, steady, calling him back from the edge. They regrouped behind a stand of rock, backs pressed together, breath ragged. A charge came from the south, heavy and fast. He knew then there would be no retreat, no last stand worth the name unless it ended this. He stepped out, drawing fire, shouting, pulling men toward him, buying space. Shots slammed into the rocks around him, into him. He felt his legs weaken, felt the world tilt. She reached him as he fell. He saw her kneeling there, blood on her hand that wasn't all his, eyes fierce and shining. He wanted to tell her it was enough, that she was safe now. The word stayed trapped behind his teeth. She stood, lifting the rifle one last time, and the valley seemed to still around her. Her voice carried again, cutting through the noise, naming what this was. Not revenge. An ending. The final shots echoed long after the men began to break and run. Fear finally outweighed rage. 500 became fewer, then fewer still, scattering back into the hills they'd come from, leaving the land littered with what they'd brought. When it was over, the valley was quiet in a way it had never been before. She buried him near the well where they'd first met, under a sky washed clean by smoke and time. She stayed on the land. Others came eventually. Not fighters. Families. Children. The ranch grew into something larger than one life. At dusk, when the wind moved through the grass just right, it sounded almost like breathing. And in that sound lived the proof that what they'd chosen, what they defended, had been worth everything it cost. The land did not change all at once. It never did. It shifted the way mountains did, slowly enough that only those who stayed could feel it. The first winter after the fighting was hard. The cabin was gone, reduced to blackened beams and stone. She slept under canvas stretched tight against the wind, fire close, rifle closer. Some nights the cold cut deep enough to wake her shaking, and she would sit staring into the dark, listening for hooves that never came. Grief moved through her in waves, not loud, not dramatic, but heavy and patient. In spring, she rebuilt. Not the same way. Not in the same place. The new house rose closer to the creek. Stone first, then timber. Thick walls meant to last. People began to pass through again, cautious at first, then curious. They asked questions she did not always answer. They saw the markers in the ground and understood enough. A woman arrived one afternoon with 2 small children and nowhere left to go. Then another family. then a man with tools and tired eyes who stayed, because staying felt safer than moving on. The valley filled, not with guns, but with voices, with laughter that surprised her the first time she heard it. At night, she told stories by firelight, not legends, not battles, small things. How the land sounded before dawn, how water tasted when you'd earned it, how family wasn't always something you were born into, but something you built, one choice at a time. Sometimes she walked alone to the grave by the well. She spoke there, quietly, telling him what the day had been like, who had arrived, what had grown. The wind answered back the way it always had, steady and sure. Years later, when the valley no longer remembered fear the way it once had, children ran where men had died. Grass grew thick again. The scars softened. People called the place a refuge, a beginning. And on evenings when the sun sank low and painted the land gold, she would stand and watch it, feeling the weight of everything that had been lost and everything that had been saved. The silence returned then, but it was no longer empty. It was full of life. Years passed in a way that felt both swift and endless. Seasons turned the valley over and over, teaching it new colors. The creek cut deeper, steadier, as if it had learned patience from what it had witnessed. Fences rose where none had stood. Fields followed. The place took on a shape that held people instead of pushing them away. She grew older there, strong in a quieter way. The lines on her face were earned honestly, etched by sun and wind, and watching over others while they slept. Children came to her with scraped knees and questions too large for their small voices. She answered what she could. For the rest, she taught them how to listen to land, how to read the sky, how to know when fear was useful and when it was only noise. On certain evenings, when the air turned still and the light fell just right, she would feel him close, not as a ghost, not as a memory that hurt, more like a presence folded into the ground itself. She had learned that love did not always leave when a body did. Sometimes it stayed in what had been protected, in what had been passed on. One summer brought riders again, not an army, just a handful of men with tired horses and weary eyes. They asked if this was the place where 500 had come and failed. She nodded once. They asked why anyone would stay after that. She looked past them, toward the fields, the creek, the children chasing each other through tall grass. Because someone had to, she said. They left without trouble. When the first real town council met beneath a canvas roof, they asked her to speak. She stood where the land sloped gently down, where everyone could see her hands were empty. She told them the valley had been bought with blood, but it would not be ruled by it. She told them laws mattered only if they kept families safe. She told them the dead did not need revenge. They needed remembrance. No one argued. Near the end of her life, she walked more slowly. The well was still there, stones worn smooth by time and touch. She sat beside it one evening as the sky burned red and gold, the same way it had on the day everything began. Children's voices drifted from the distance. A dog barked. Somewhere, a hammer rang against wood. She closed her eyes and let the sound settle. When she was laid to rest, it was beside him, where the ground dipped slightly and the grass grew thickest. No markers carved with grand words. Just stones simple and strong, set deep enough that they would not move. The valley went on. Travelers spoke of it in low voices, not as a place of ghosts, but as a place where something fierce had been turned into something lasting, where a man and a woman had chosen each other against the weight of the world, and by doing so had changed the shape of it. At dusk, when the wind moved the grass, it still carried dust instead of rain, but now it also carried laughter and the steady sound of life continuing. And that was the ending they had earned.